Hi, can you tell me who you are?
Mark Mauriello.
Mark, who are you and who did you represent here today in Atlantic City?
I was here representing myself as a 30-year DEP employee and a coastal property owner for my entire life.
Okay, and for folks who may not recognize you, Mark is a former commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection in New Jersey. Um, Today you were before the joint committees, environmental committees of the Senate and Assembly of the New Jersey Legislature. We're holding a hearing in Atlantic City on the status of the recovery efforts the state has made in New Jersey following Superstorm Sandy. Could you give us the high points of your testimony here today, Mark, and who you were what points you were making?
The Cliff Note version of it touched on several points. One was what we perceive to be a real lack of comprehensive planning for how we redevelop, how we recover from the storm. A lot of concern about land use management, which seems to be absent in what we see as part of the recovery. There's a lot of rebuilding, higher standards, which are good, buildings being elevated, but we're putting everything back in the same places. And if we expect a different outcome the next time we have a big storm, then I think we're kidding ourselves. So I was trying to make the point to the committee that we need a planning process that is much more open and involves much more folks with interest in these coastal issues. We'll get much better outcomes. We can't just rely on beach nourishment as the solution to our problems because it's not sustainable over the long term. It's very expensive, it's very temporary, and it should have a complementary program of acquisition to go along with it. So as we're pouring sand into the ocean to rebuild the beaches, we're also pulling back a little bit from the shoreline to create space for these beaches and dunes to sustain themselves over time. Those were some of my primary concerns that seem to be ignored. I touched a little bit on the emergency rulemaking that the DEP has initiated over the past 9 months and how they seem to just put these rules out and apply them. They're not necessarily being responsive to the input they get, and I was particularly surprised to see the agency ignore comments from FEMA. And FEMA responded formally on the record to amendments to the flood hazard rules, and the DEP made no changes on adoption. And the comments reflected inconsistencies with the rule and the National Flood Insurance Program requirements. Pretty significant issue. So I think it all fits under the umbrella of they need to open and be a little more visionary in terms of how they develop policy, take advantage of the expertise that exists outside of the department. A lot of smart folks out there who can offer productive ideas and solutions. And with all this money being spent, there's a big concern that we're spending this money, and it's great that the federal government was benevolent. You know, Uncle Sugar came home and delivered a lot of money. That money's going to be spent. It's not going to be recurring, but the storms will be recurring, and that's our problem. And we're not really adapting to what we know the future will be like. And without doing that, we're pretty much setting ourselves up for repetitive problems and damages and costs and misery.
Mark, those FEMA comments you mentioned, could you encapsulate them? Were they looking for more areas to be off limits for rebuilding or higher structures, or what was it in general?
There were several. Some had to do with requirements that allow for wet flood proofing of new structures, which means you allow floodwaters into buildings. Some had to do with the elevation standard and the specific language. I know you can get copies. If you go back to the comment response document, it'll be pretty easy to see exactly what the comment was and what the response was. I mentioned the fact that the coastal zone management rules that were amended on an emergency rulemaking essentially allow towns to bulldoze their beaches somewhat indiscriminately in ways that will prevent the dunes from building up naturally. And this is something we prohibited for forever at DEP. So it was really, it ignored 30 years of really good data and science, and that's a bit frustrating because it's one thing if you don't know better, but we do know better, and still we're not necessarily making the right decisions.
What do you think is driving that approach?
Well, I think there seems to be a move to delegate a lot of responsibility under state statutes to local communities. And I think in some cases it makes sense, but there's a reason why these laws are enacted and empower the state to manage certain areas. It's because communities either were unwilling or incapable of doing so. Otherwise, you'd have no need for the statute. So when you look back at the origin of these laws, in this case CAFRA, and you read the committee statements and the findings, and CAFRA was amended in '93, so the legislature reaffirmed what it did in 1973, 20 years later, with some of the same concerns, and it didn't involve delegating authority. So I'm a little concerned about the lack of control, because I think with the DEP management and oversight, you have much more unbiased decision making. You're not focused on a one town interest. You're looking at coast-wide interests and really the public interest.
Great. Mark, we appreciate the time you've given us today to talk with us. Is there somewhere where folks could reach you online?
I currently am working with Edgewood Properties in Piscataway, and if you Google Edgewood Properties, you'll find me.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right.